Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Al24 News channel, and welcome to our special live coverage of the latest regarding the Russian-Ukrainian file. Events are quickly moving and developing on both the ground and at the international levels, with in-depth discussions with our panel of guests via phone. Mahfoud Ali Zoui, university lecturer from Algeria; Benjamin Barton, assistant professor at Nottingham University from Malaysia via Skype, in addition to Mohammed Al-Zaidawi, journalist from Paris. All of this right after this break. Welcome back, and we start with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov and his Ukrainian counterpart Dmitry Kuleba have held face-to-face talks in Antalya, Turkey. Ukraine says it has opened 7 humanitarian corridors through which civilians can be evacuated to safety. In addition to, UNICEF says dozens of children have been killed amid Moscow's offensive attacks. Well, I start my discussion with you, Benjamin. Regarding the latest updates that I have just read, what are your first comments?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's Moscow and Kiev are both trying to find a way out of this situation through dialogue, or at least that's the impression which is being given. Now, whether both sides are actually really committed to dialogue is another thing altogether. I think personally that the Russians are opening this channel of dialogue mostly to keep the international community hopeful that a solution can be reached by dialogue, but it might also be a smokescreen to allow Moscow to continue with its operation in the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. As for the reports of killings of children, which is a terrible act in war. That wouldn't be a surprise, because it does appear that the killing of civilians has taken place. So at least that has been reported by the Ukrainian side.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the bombardment of hospitals, let's follow this report about Ukraine, who has accused Russia of bombing a children's hospital and maternity area in the besieged port city of Mariupol, wounding 17 people and trapping children and others under the rubble in what it called a war crime without justification. In this report by Zahra Farjani.
Authorities in Ukraine have accused Russian forces of dropping bombs on a maternity hospital in the city of Mariupol. The ground shook more than a mile away when the Mariupol complex was hit by the series of blasts that blew out windows and ripped away much of the front of one building. Ukrainian police and soldiers rushed to the scene to evacuate victims.
It was an airstrike near the maternity hospital. At the moment, we continue to help the wounded and preparing to evacuate them. Police are working together with the army to help those who need it.
The attack came despite Russia agreeing to a 12-hour ceasefire to allow refugees to evacuate a number of towns and cities.
Today, Russian invaders committed a grave crime. They carried out an airstrike on the city center of Mariupol. They destroyed by bombing the maternity hospital. Women and children were wounded. It is a war crime without any justification.
President Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on Twitter that there were people, children, under the wreckage and called the strike an atrocity. In a televised video later on, Zelensky addressed the Europeans, asking them to toughen the sanctions on Russia.
You have to toughen the sanctions against Russia to put an end to this genocide. You have to pressure Russia to sit at the table of negotiations and halt this bestial war.
The Donetsk region's governor said 17 people were wounded in the attack, including women and labor. The reports could not immediately be verified. The United Nations human rights body said it was verifying the number of casualties at Mariupol.
On the other hand, following the Russian airstrikes against the maternity hospital in Mariupol city, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the attack as proof that the genocide of Ukrainians is taking place. Let's have a listen.
A children's hospital, a maternity hospital, how did they threaten the Russian Federation? What kind of country is the Russian Federation? A country afraid of maternity hospitals and destroying them. The airstrike on the maternity hospital is the ultimate proof that the genocide of Ukrainians is taking place. Europeans, you cannot say that you have not seen what is happening to Ukrainians. To Mariupol, to the inhabitants of Mariupol, you saw, you know.
У Маріуполі, з маріупольцями. Ви бачили, ви знаєте.
And to discuss further this issue, I welcome Mahfoud Ali Zoui. We have noticed that there is a change in the target of the Russian forces from Ukrainian troops to civilians and now innocent babies. Any comments, Mahfoud?
So thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. As it was expected now, the war is intensifying and the battles are becoming more and more violent. To understand, the situation, we come back to what President Putin told his French counterpart via phone. He told him that the objectives of the Russian military operation will be achieved in any case. Despite the fact that many Russian officials kept saying that the military operation is going according to the plan, it seems that the Russians are facing some problems in the ground. That's what forced them to throw bombs on civilians, and we are now watching this case of bombarding a maternity hospital. Although in this moment in the press conference after the meeting with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Lavrov said that this hospital has been seized by the Ukrainian armed nationalists a long time ago.
Let's just move to this piece of information before we discuss further. During a joint news conference in Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, alongside with his British counterpart Liz Truss, said they want to avoid a direct military confrontation with Russia, not to expand it, as both sides, the United States and the United Kingdom, have echoed their opposition to the establishment of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Let's have a listen.
But the reality is that setting up a no-fly zone would lead to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. And that is not what we are looking at. What we are looking at is making sure that the Ukrainians are able to defend their own country with the best possible selection of anti-tank weapons and anti-air defense systems.
We're also united in calling on the Kremlin to immediately allow Ukrainian civilians to safely depart the cities and towns of Ukraine that are besieged by Russian forces. Every country has a responsibility to join us in pressing Moscow to do this. This is not the time to equivocate by calling on both sides to allow civilians in Ukraine cities to leave safely. Doing so obfuscates the basic facts around why these corridors are necessary and who is blocking them.
Let me just bring into our conversation, Mohammed from Paris. Are we sure that the Russian forces are behind these attacks, or it might be a part of separatist actions or a media propaganda?
Well, the least to say since the beginning of the military operation is that we really hope to see some central command centers that maintain the operation and maintain its directions. If the theory of separatists taking such actions is even relatively true, that means we are in a huge trouble because separatists are just one section of the troop that are invading Ukraine. You have the Russian military, and of course, since we have the experience of the Russian military using mercenaries in Syria and in Libya as well, and in Africa, we can partly relatively conclude that Russia is also perhaps using mercenaries, which rises the risks of such violations. However, if we want to believe that there are command centers responsible for all of these formations in the Russian military, then yes, definitely, the Russian military holds full responsibility for this incident.
You have just raised a very important point here that I am going to bring and just put it to Benjamin. Here, what's happening exactly on the ground? We have Russian forces, we have Ukrainian forces, in addition to some separatists, to some mercenaries from different backgrounds. What's happening on the ground?
Well, obviously, the Russian army is trying to advance and it's faced a number of difficulties. I don't think it anticipated the resistance, the organization from the Ukrainian side, which obviously is not going to let the Russians roll all over them. And, as mentioned by the previous speaker, the Russians are also turning to mercenaries who are in place, separatists who, of course, have their own agenda to drive forward the independence of their claims over sovereign Ukrainian territory. And, they're handy in a way because they're not Russian nationals, but they're willing to fight, apparently, for compensation. That puts Russian soldiers at a lesser risk than having to, put them at the front where they are apparently the victim of successful Ukrainian resistance.
Do you think, Mahfoud, if you're just listening to our discussion, that this would help the Russian forces to advance more towards the capital, taking into consideration to media sources, they are 20 kilometers away from the capital, Kiev?
So, because of the apparent disbalance of power between Ukraine and Russia, it is very hard to imagine that the Russians will not be able to crush Ukraine, even after a long-term war. But we should look at the horrible consequences of a long-term war for Russian economy as well as for Ukraine. Analysts and strategists talk about possible outcomes of the war. 2 or 3 main, most likely scenarios have been discussed. The first scenario is that is the official narrative of the Russian government, which said that the objective is to demilitarize Ukraine by it's already destroying the military infrastructure in Ukraine and to guarantee a neutral status of Ukraine. A second scenario may be to divide the country into 2 parts, and the leadership of Ukraine will move to the west, probably to the city of Lviv, from where they will be operating a huge insurgency in the east, and also it will be easier for them to get supplies from the NATO. The third scenario, and the most horrible scenario, the scenario that Washington wants to avoid, is a large-scale confrontation with the NATO. That's why the Americans refused to supply Ukraine with fighter jets through Poland because as the Pentagon declares, we do not want to raise the potential of escalation because any act like this can be interpreted by the Russians as a direct intervention from the NATO. So this is the most horrible scenario that the Americans and the NATO so far are trying to avoid. But with the intensification of the battles, no one can know the outcomes of this war.
According to your analysis, Mahfoud, let me just bring into our conversation Mohammed from Paris. You said you have talked about long-term, in case, a scenario that you have put in the first hand, a long-term war or conflict. Do you think, Mohammed, that if it's going to be the case, are we supposed to see and to witness the battle happen only on the Ukrainian grounds?
Well, to begin with, the battle in the meantime is happening on the Ukrainian grounds, and it is not likely that the battle scene further, because if the battle scenes expands, that means the forces fueling the battle are increasing, and in this situation, that means the interfering of other countries. Well, if we're lucky, as humans, apart from the conflict, that won't happen, because if the NATO intervenes into the conflict, or if any other country intervened or took part in the conflict, the area of the conflict will increase and expand to engulf further countries, which is, of course, not the aim of the Russian Federation, as far as their initiatives and talks with the Ukrainian part. And of course, it's not the aim of the NATO, looking that they have even given up delivering fighter jets to Ukraine, as was supposed to be via Poland. And itself, so that such, and yeah.
Oh, all right. Mohammed, you have talked about an important point here that I am going to put to Benjamin. Why, if the war is not going to proceed further, why do you think that Russia is failing to create a government in Ukraine where it supports Russia?
Well, because it's not that straightforward. I mean, you can see that Zelensky is not willing to give up power. So even, let's imagine that the Russians believe that they've ousted Zelensky, and they put in place a puppet regime, which is obviously part of the objective. Then you're going to have two voices, effectively speaking, for the Ukrainian people. And how credible will that new regime be, especially if it's not recognized by the rest of the international community, which will necessarily be the case.
But don't you think, Benjamin, that this is the target of President Putin after, if he wants the capital to fall? What is the purpose?
No, obviously that's the aim. It is to change the regime. But I mean, you know, if we believe that Ukraine might possibly be split into two, and even if Zelensky is driven out of power, you know, there will be a Ukrainian government outside of the Ukraine trying to govern the Ukraine at the same time as the puppet regime installed by Moscow, and that puppet regime, in any case, will struggle for recognition because of the wall of sanctions which are currently being built around Russia, will naturally impact, you know, this new regime in the same way that, you know, Belarus is also being impacted because of its proximity to Moscow.
Well, Mahfoud, if a puppet regime, as Benjamin has just said, is installed in Russia, do you think that it is going to stop this war?
I don't think so. So this is one of the possible scenarios. If Kiev falls to the Russians, they will install there a puppet government to be controlled from Moscow. But this is a very unlikely scenario that an insurgency in Ukrainian lands will not take place. I mean, now today the United Nations. The United States of America agreed on a $14 billion financial aid to Ukraine. It means that the Western allies will not easily let on the regime in Ukraine fall, because they believe if this happens, Russia will not stop there, and countries like Poland and other neighboring Baltic countries will support the maximum the Ukrainian regime. So it's very unexpected that the Western allies of Ukraine will easily let the Ukrainian president fall.
All right. We will return to this point and let's all move together to read this piece of information where Russia said on Thursday a Ukrainian claim that it bombed a children's hospital in Mariupol was fake news, stating that the building was a former maternity hospital that had long been taken over by troops. Polyansky said Russia had warned on March the 7th that the hospital had been turned into a military object from which Ukrainians were firing. Here, back to you, Benjamin. What does it mean, a no-fly zone?
So a no-fly zone would be enforced by third parties who would be neutral to a country to avoid, both parties effectively using the airspace over the Ukraine to bomb specific targets. So it's similar to what happened in, say, 2011 in Libya when a no-fly zone was voted by the United Nations Security Council and then was supposed to be enforced by France and the UK during the civil war there. So that's an idea which has been floated, but there are two challenges here. First of all, you would need the approval of the United Nations Security Council to make that no-fly zone credible and enforceable and legal. But the problem there is, of course, Russia is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. And the second element, as mentioned by the British foreign minister there in the excerpt, is that it cannot be enforced by any NATO country, because that would simply be an act conceived as an act of aggression by Moscow, and it would trigger the unthinkable, which would be an open conflict between Russia and NATO.
All right, Mahfoud, why is the US, I bring into our discussion Mohammed, why is the USA avoiding such a direct confrontation with Russia? Mohammed?
Well, it's not just the United States that is avoiding the conflict. We could see that efforts from different countries around the world, different NATO members are avoiding the conflict because, in military strategic studies in Baghdad, once I had the opportunity to read the booklet, it says, no matter what the cost is to prevent a war, prevent a war, because the cost of war is more expensive than than to prevent it. The United States have lived through a very harsh period economically and on national security wise during the Cold War, and that is something they are not willing to repeat. Of course, not just the United States that lived through hard period throughout that time, but the entire world lived it because the Soviet Union was trying to attract part of the world and the West was trying so, and that created conflicts in the Middle East. For example, Iraq war for 8 years, and you've got the chain continues to the Arab-Israeli conflicts, although the context is a bit different. Etc., etc., etc. So a conflict between the NATO and Russia, and of course Russian allies, because the NATO is a cluster of allies, and of course Russia will activate its cluster of allies to confront it. That would lead to the unthinkable, which is a third world war, which is what the world entirely is at least officially avoiding.
Here, do you agree, Benjamin, on the comments of Mohammed here?
Yeah, I think I agree with the point that the United States does not want war. I mean, President Biden has just last year removed the troops out of Afghanistan, and that was a disaster. Then there's a promise to do the same thing in Iraq. However, if say, and I hope this doesn't happen, but let's say if NATO and Russia do somehow end up fighting one another, I sincerely doubt that Russia will be able to mobilize any of its so-called allies, perhaps with the exception of Belarus. But even then, they've struggled to do that thus far. I think Russia will be pretty isolated. Although Russia is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I don't think any of the other members would like to be drawn into this conflict, whether they're from Central Asia, whether it's India, Pakistan, Iran, and least of all China. So, but I think thus far, both sides recognize that there is that risk, and I think that they don't want to breach that risk because, the consequences would be very dire.
Let's read this all together. After the international fear and Ukrainian accusation of Russia of shelling the Ukrainian nuclear power plant Chernobyl, Russia has accused the Ukrainian forces of targeting the Chernobyl infrastructure. Russia denied Ukrainian claim of targeting the nuclear power plant and insisted that Ukrainian forces did so. Mahmoud here, don't you think that the Ukrainian forces are doing their best in order to, or doing all of this in purpose, just to destroy Russia through bringing all Western and European countries against it? Because here, and according to the speech of President Zelensky, whenever he speaks to media, he always targets Russia and talks about its destruction, including Russian President Putin.
Well, when it comes to the balance of power, it is visibly in the of the Russians. So even if the Ukrainians succeed, in resisting the Russian invasion, it is very hard to imagine that they are able to stop the invasion. But the scenario, the most likely scenario, is that when the Russian troops get into the cities, there will be a street war. The Americans are supplying more weaponry that is fit to be used in street wars and guerrilla wars. But at the same time, the Americans have been very clear from the very beginning that they will not be sending any troops to Ukraine. At the same time, the fall of Ukraine will have some dangerous consequences for the United States of America, for the NATO, and for the world security in general. That's why, apart from sending troops to Ukraine, the Americans are ready to do anything. Right now, we see how they are deploying gradually all the available instruments, legal instruments, political instruments, economic instruments. Now we are talking about an economic war led by the West against Russia. We see that the multinational firms suspending their operations in Russia, which means that thousands of employees in Russia will lose their jobs, which will exert a lot of pressure on interiorly at the regime, the ruling regime in Russia. So every escalation is going on, and everything is possible.
Benjamin, Mahfoud has said something quite important as far as, let's say, as I have understood, that the United States is going to do anything. But the paradox here, don't you think that as far as the United States is geographically away from Europe and what's happening on the borders or in Ukraine and Russia, they are feeling safe?
Yes, well, of course, geographically they're safe, even though there are, of course, American interests in the Ukraine, their people, economic interests. But to be honest, American hegemony worldwide is premised on ensuring the stability of Europe. And that's been the case since the end of the Second World War. So although, this conflict is geographically a very long way away from Washington and other major US cities, for the United States politically, this is critical. I mean, they cannot get this one wrong. And the situation is not all that different to the way it was, in terms of the rivalry with Russia, although back then it was the Soviet Union after World War II. So the Americans know that if Russia is successful in Ukraine and that there is a pro-Russian state very close to, of course, the borders of NATO and the European Union, this presents a real risk for the United States and for its role as the global hegemon.
Let's move on to listen to Russian ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, who said in response to mass media questions that the US administration shows by its statements that they are highly concerned of disclosed truth about their military biological program near Russian borders. Let's have a listen.
Such nervous statements by the U.S. authorities indicate the serious concern of the White House about the revelation of the truth about the ongoing work of the military biological program near the borders of the Russian Federation funded by the USA.
A very important meeting along with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is greeted by his Turkish counterpart Mevlut meeting since Russia started a military operation in Ukraine on February the 24th. Let's have a listen.
I did my best to at least find a diplomatic solution to the humanitarian tragedy unfolding on the battleground and in the besieged cities.
There is nothing to replace negotiation process between the two sides. We have confirmed on a daily basis that our proposal for the opening of humanitarian corridors is still valid.
Back to you, Mahfouz. To what extent is Russia relying on this meeting?
Well, as a matter of fact, the only way out of this conflict is through negotiations and diplomatic means. We see that from the previous rounds of talks in Belarus that negotiations did not advance well, but yet if these doors of negotiations are opened, we will expect the worst. So there will be, it seems that part of the problem is that now one of the objectives of this military operation should be achieved in any case. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are saying that the conditions set back by the Russians for negotiations means directly a surrender, which is not the Ukrainians are intended to do at the foreseeable future, at least. So also there is an important factor related to this conflict, which is on the lack of truth. We listen to declarations from...
I put this to you, Mohammed. Do you think that this meeting may come up with some positive results and push forward upcoming negotiations?
This meeting in particular could be the beginning of the initiative to solve the whole problem diplomatically. However, we can notice through the attitude of NATO, by preventing mass attacking weapons, strategic bombers of any kind, is that NATO is willing to present defense weapons in order to ensure that when the real time for negotiations comes, Ukrainians will be negotiating on better terms than the ones they are supposed to, which is a mass invasion of Ukraine by the Russian part. This one could be the opening. However, this opening is not quite strong because, as we could see, the meddling here is by Turkey. On the other hand, if the meddling has been conducted by a European state such as Germany or any country of heavy decision inside the NATO, we will enter the end of the war when that happens. But for the meantime, since Turkey is meddling and since other, let's say, in fact, like the marginal members, and thus I doubt that this initiative in particular will go any further than just agreeing on humanitarian corridors and not bombing hospitals, or basically even sharing the positions of sensitive humanitarian locations like hospitals. And
Mohammed has he said that, Turkey doesn't have enough power or heavy power in order to come up with something with this trilateral meeting. According to you, Benjamin, what are your comments on this? And do you think that it is an opportunity for Turkey to improve its relations with the United States and the European Union and NATO?
I think Mohammed makes a very good point. And I would thought actually that Turkey has a role to play here. I mean, this smacks of Erdogan typically positioning Turkey as a kingmaker in a way, similar to what he's done in the Middle East and the wider Gulf region. But I think that Turkey can play a very important role, indeed, because it probably has a bit more credibility than most NATO member states in terms of facilitating dialogue between the two sides. There's also the strategic position that Turkey holds with access to the Black Sea through the Bosphorus. And also, what we've heard is that Turkey itself has been involved directly in the conflict by supporting, reportedly, the Ukrainian side through the use of drones and shelling the position of Russian artillery moving through the Ukraine. So, no, I think that Turkey could potentially play that role of a broker. I think the issue about right smack bang in the middle of this conflict. So will the Russians tolerate them? I think that's going to be problematic. So perhaps a country which is a little bit more neutral, if you like, such as Turkey, may end up playing a critical role. And perhaps, the Russian side in particular may be more willing to listen to Turkey than any other of the NATO member states.
Let's read this piece of information. Dmitry Kuleba accused Russia of breaking ceasefire accords and bombarding the humanitarian corridor from Zaporizhzhia to Mariupol, where Russia, on the other hand, promised to provide humanitarian corridors in Ukraine to allow citizens caught up in war zones to evacuate. Kiev is not convinced and called the move a publicity stunt. Here back to you, Mahfoud. Russia insists it targets military infrastructure and avoids civilians. Does this give Russia the green light to proceed with its military operation? Mahfoud?
Okay, thank you so much. Before this, I want to elaborate on today's Turkey meeting.
Go ahead.
In fact, no one expects a major mediation table is very important, and this should not in any way be underestimated. So, coming back to your question,
please briefly, please, since we are running out of time. Please, go ahead, Mahfoud.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I do. Just briefly speaking, all right?
Okay, great.
Okay.
So, coming back to your question, I believe that the war will be escalating even more in the upcoming days because of the failure, as we can depict the negotiations. We expect also the death toll to increase. More civilians will be killed, and according to the United Nations figures, right now over 2 million Ukrainians left already the country, and they expect that this figure may increase from 5 to 10 million refugees, and this will be also a great challenge for Western Europe and the United States as well.
Okay. Yes. Now, economically speaking, Mohammed, USA assistance for Ukraine, $13.6 billion spending bill passes House and proceeds to Senate. Don't you think that the USA is paying a lot for this proxy war?
The US is paying, and most of these funds are officially announced to be for reconstruction or for any other purposes, but definitely it will all go for funding the Ukrainian groups, military groups, and army and defense forces to withhold or to attempt to withhold the Russian invasion. On the other hand, as big as it sounds, it's not going to present an equation changer because the mass
all right,
of
Mohammed,
the Russian forces is larger.
Mohammed, sorry to cut you. Probably we'll go back to your answer in a bit because we have just right now a live event where U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris and Polish President are having a press conference. Let's have a listen.
Thank you. Dziękuję bardzo.
Well, we have just followed the press conference held on the Polish grounds by U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, in addition to Polish President. And here, in her final word, Kamala Harris has highlighted the stance of the United States regarding the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and dedicating the full support of the United States to the Ukrainian people and refugees. Well, back to you, Mohammed. Any comments regarding this very important, let's say, visit of Kamala Harris to Poland?
Well, as part of the U.S. propaganda machine, U.S. politicians tend to visit different parts of the world, especially conflict-affected zones and zones close to it, in order to ensure the American presence in the zone, or at least close to it. Mm-hmm. American support to Poland is actually an American indirect support to Ukraine, because Poland is the closest neighbor and has a mutual ancestor with the Slavic group of Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, Poland has, since the very beginning of the war and prior to the military operations, has been attempting to meddle in the Ukrainian situation, and as we could see right now, the United States is trying to reinforce its presence to say that we are allies of the Polish, and we will do our best to support them.
All right, we really wanted to listen to the comments of both Benjamin in addition to Mahfoud. However, we are absolutely running out of time. I have to thank heartily all of Benjamin Barton, who joined us from Malaysia via Skype, in addition to Mohammed Al-Zaidawi from Paris, in addition to Mahfoud Ali Zoui from Algeria. That's all for today's live coverage. Thank you so much for following us on Al 24 News. Bye-bye.